Hello and welcome to our first ever NGOCC podcast. I am excited to be your host for this particular podcast. So this podcast will give you different insights. Just getting to understand the woman and the advocates that this particular NGOCC does for the people, for the Zambians, but as well for the 111 members that we have. Hosting you, my name is Chibesa Mbewe-Anamela. On our first ever episode, we want to give you an insight on what NGOCC really is, so that you can really get to understand what we do and who we are. So I'm joined by a very amazing woman who I'm sure you must be familiar with. So on today's first episode, I am being joined by the Executive Director for NGOCC. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, Cecilia, and thank you very much for inviting me.
We are happy to have you here. So perhaps before we even start talking about the organization, I'm sure people would want to know and understand who is Miss Anamela Mbewe.
Okay, Miss Mbewe-Anamela is a development specialist. I have worked in the development arena now for about 30 years in different sectors, covering water, sanitation, microfinance, gender equity and equality, education, public financial management, so quite a number of sectors. My passion really has been around gender equity and equality, and especially also working with the youth to ensure that they reach their maximum potential.
Yes, thank you so much. Now, we are talking about NGOCC and just wanting to get an insight on what NGOCC really is. So perhaps you could give us a brief history of how NGOCC started, what it is, and just allow people to understand what NGOCC really is.
Okay, thank you. NGOCC actually started in 1985. It started as a consortium of about 14 member organizations that wanted to come together to ensure that the voice of women that advocate around gender equity and equality was united, because they felt that for as long as there was no unity, it wouldn't be, the voice would not be as strong as it should be. So there was a conference in Nairobi, a women's conference in Nairobi, and from examples that they learned there, these women came back to Zambia now and started NGOCC. And over the years, NGOCC is now going to turn 40 this year in 2025. And over the years, NGOCC grew to more than just being a mouthpiece, but to being a coordinating body of a number of organizations as the numbers began to increase. At the moment, we have 111 member organizations, and these comprise of non-government organizations, community-based organizations, and faith-based organizations. And this coordinating role is more prominent now, given the size of the number of organizations. And besides being a coordinating body, NGOCC is also focused on advocacy around issues of legal and policy reform to try and ensure that policies that we have in the country that facilitate women's empowerment are working, and if there are any gaps that we advocate for the introduction of laws that will lead us into gender equity and equality.
Very interesting. Now, having understood the background of NGOCC, how it started, and now I'm very curious because you talked about 111 members. I want to ask, how are you managing them? How are you managing to coordinate everything? But before we delve into that particular discussion, I want to find out what is the mission and vision of NGOCC, and how does it help you to coordinate your 111 members?
Well, I think it's very important for any organization to have the mission and the vision, and that helps you stay focused. So our mission is to ensure that women are empowered to participate in social, economic, political, and cultural development aspects of the country, because we think that inclusion is very, very important, and there is no sector of society that should be left out. So this is on the basis of our understanding that women have been left out in many ways. So our focus is primarily on ensuring that we empower women to participate equally.
Very interesting. Now, I have seen quite a number of projects that have been done by NGOCC, a number of commentaries made regarding the girl child and wanting to empower women. What other projects have you engaged in as NGOCC that has put you out there? Because no one doesn't know about NGOCC, and how have you managed to reach this far?
I think the thing about NGOCC is that over the years, there were certain issues that we advocated for that we've actually come to see it to fruition. For example, we're going into International Women's Day. It was NGOCC that advocated for the 8th of March to be recognized in Zambia as a public holiday. Thank you. And in addition to that, there are a number of legal frameworks that have come about as a result of NGOCC's advocacy. One of them is that we now have a Gender Equity and Equality Act, which we didn't have before. We have an Anti-Gender-Based Violence Act of 2011. We also have the famous and I think very, very important re-entry policy, which allows girl children to go back to school even when, by some unfortunate circumstance, they either maybe fall into child marriage or they have an early pregnancy. They're able to go back to school. In the past, when a girl child got pregnant, that was the end of school. There was no school that would readmit them. So NGOCC, I think, has worked quite a bit, to get certain policy and legal frameworks in place and to get the recognition of the importance of women, even by celebrating International Women's Day. These are just but a few, but there have been a lot of strides. Even in the early days, for example, in the 70s and 80s, a married woman would not be permitted to go on paid maternity leave. All this came out as a result of advocacy. Even when NGOCC came into effect in 1985, there was advocacy around ensuring that there were equal wages for women, and that women's other roles were appreciated and also rewarded to some extent, and that women are not punished for being who they are and for doing what they are supposed to do.
Yeah, after giving me this insight regarding the different milestones that you have done as NGOCC, then this makes you want to find out what your objectives are, what drives you to want to do this. Let's see some of the objectives for NGOCC.
Okay, NGOCC is guided by 5-year strategic plans. The current strategic plan has 4 key objectives. One of the initial areas that we thought we needed to really focus on was the issue of attitudes, the traditional beliefs, practices, and all these norms and values. Because when we did our analysis of what exactly was driving these gender inequities and inequalities, what we then discovered was that at the root of it all are these traditional thoughts, the traditional norms, the practices. Not all traditional practices or cultural or culture is wrong, but there are some that are negative that tend to drive some of what we see now as gender inequities and inequalities. So the first objective is around addressing those. It's not an easy thing to do because it takes time to see the results, but we are getting results in certain areas. For example, like fighting against early marriage. Early marriage was actually a traditional practice, but now people are beginning to understand that girl children should be given a chance to go to school. The second one is that for us, to ensure that some of what we advocate for is protected. We have an objective that looks at legal policy, legal frameworks and policies. So we advocate for policies and legal frameworks that protect women and girls, or that try to accelerate our advancement towards gender equity and equality. But while we're doing that, we have to look at the well-being of a woman. So we have a fourth objective that looks at building the resilience of women to withstand shocks. When we talk about shocks, there's issues such as COVID. Imagine we had COVID, and a lot of families suffered because people were not prepared for a shock like that. There were job losses, there was loss of lives, there was loss of business because there are certain things that couldn't be done in COVID. So under that objective, we look at firstly maybe the economic empowerment of women. We look at sexual and reproductive health so that women have control over the social and reproductive issues. We also look at access, for instance, to finance for women. We look at issues of climate change, how it affects women, and how women can mitigate against that and adapt, to the climatic changes. And we also look at women in leadership. How do we prepare women to participate in leadership in every sphere? At national level, at local government level, and even at ward level, and even both in public and private life. So that one is very important because we can't just look at policy and legal frameworks without ignoring the woman for whom we're here for. And then the third one is, of course, we have to have a membership that has the capacity for us to achieve these objectives that we have. So this fourth objective is around enhancing our collective capacity as NGOCC to deliver on what we do. So it's about looking at our strategies and, constantly adapting to our learning and improving our skills so that we can, deliver adequately on our objectives.
It's a lot of work that you're doing, and I pray that every person out there is being helped, in a very positive manner. I did a little bit of some research, and I saw some of the documentaries that you've done with YWCA in Western Province, some of the programs that have been conducted in Western Province, especially those areas where child marriages are rampant and the numbers are high. Now, I would want to then understand, you mentioned something like the strategic plan that NGOs is operating. How has it evolved over the years? How have you managed to change plans every 5 years? How have you grown as an organization?
But what informs a strategic plan is the context. So the first thing that goes into strategic planning is for you to understand the context. What is the context telling us now? What the context would be then at that particular time might be different from what it was. Remember, I spoke about the time when there wasn't even any paid maternity leave for women. So we cannot talk about advocating for that in this day and age, because, that was dealt with. So you have to look at what are the main contextual issues. So the context and what is happening around you is what normally informs what you should focus on at the time. So that's the start of the strategic plan.
Now, what are some of the key programs that NGOCC is working on currently?
Okay, within those four objectives, we have a focus on gender-based violence. And when you look at gender-based violence comes in different forms. We have economic violence, we have physical violence, we have even psychological violence. So it comes in different forms. But within there, we also look at issues of child defilement, rape. We look at physical violence, also in terms of child marriage and early childhood pregnancy, because that in a form is defilement. So we have a way that we define gender-based violence very broadly, but also specifically. We also have a program that looks at financial inclusion for women, where we work with women to develop what we call these village banking schemes to make sure that those women that are excluded from the formal banking sector, from the formal financial sector, still have access to finance and are able to learn how to grow their savings and to grow their wealth. We have also a program on environmental adaptation, where we look at how women can adapt to the environment, especially around agriculture, and also how they can use some of the challenges around the climate change as a business. For example, we teach women how to make special stoves that do not use charcoal. And as they learn how to make those, we also teach them to use that as a business. They can make those and sell them. Also, how they can use even solar lights, to ensure that their businesses open later, because before, especially in those areas where there is they're not on the electricity grid. Then we have the programs that look at early childhood marriage actually work with traditional leaders to retrieve girl children that have gone into early marriage and put them back into school. And what we've also done is, especially areas where there's no power, there's no electricity, we will even provide solar lights to those girls so that we make sure that, they have power to study at night and to improve their grades. And I must say that the results have been very, very good. So those are, and then besides that, there's the issue of women in leadership. We did launch a campaign at the end of last year, which is looking forward to the 2026 general elections, dubbed Her Time Is Now. That campaign is to try and get more women into elected positions, into political positions. So it's about sensitizing communities on why it's important for women to be at the table, at every decision-making table, and also to encourage women to come forward as possible candidates. So it's just to try and change this narrative of dominance of men in all these positions and ensure that the voice of women, which is very important, by the way, because we form more than 50% of the population in Zambia, So our voices must be heard.
Very true. Very powerful. Now, you mentioned some of the projects that you've done, the reduction of the young child in school, ending child marriages. So what are some of the strategies that you use to foster this mindset in people? And also, how do you just manage to bring people together, teach them a few skills? What are some of just the strategies that you've been using as an organization to foster the mindset in people? Because I believe that changing mindset is like one of the most difficult things to do.
Indeed, you're right. It's very, very difficult. I think one of the advantages we have as NGOCC is because we're a network. We have a lot of organizations across the country and at community level. So we even have what we call a household approach, where we have organizations and where we have women that we have worked with and sensitized and trained. Actually, even go to at household level and speak to the issues of gender equity and equality, why that is important. For example, a married man and woman to plan together and even include their children. And we find that when we do that, those women are actually even empowered to go out into the community and seek leadership positions. And very, very important and critical in this is that in the rural areas, we have our traditional leaders. And these are the custodians of culture, of norms, of practices. So we've worked with most of them, and a number of them actually understand why, some of these cultural practices may not be beneficial. And they actually ensure that these things are not happening in their communities. We even have bylaws that have been worked on with these traditional leaders that guide how the community should respond if, for instance, there's an early child marriage or a child that has dropped out of school because of pregnancy. So working with traditional leaders has really been beneficial to us, but also just ensuring that the community is sensitized. We have community members now. For example, another area that we work in is helping communities understand budgeting processes. Why it's important for them to know, firstly, what the budget is, to input into the national budget and to monitor the budgetary expenditures. So some of those, because we've made them so aware of what the national plans and budgets are even able to go and hold to account some of their own civic leaders. They even around CDF, for instance, they're able to go in and say, look, you had approved this project. It should have ended in March. Why hasn't it ended up to now? Where are the monies? How are you monitoring it? And then they hold them to account and ensure that these projects are going on, because they know that this is their money and there must be accountability.
All this work that you are doing may come with some challenges. So I'm sure the audience would also want to understand, as an organization, what are some of the challenges that you are facing? How have you been able to overcome them to ensure that you meet your objectives?
Okay. One of the challenges, I think, is that because we speak for a constituency, there are times when it might not be possible that you all might have a shared understanding and agreement around something. So in this coordination role, sometimes navigating that may not be very easy. Trying to get a shared understanding, to get agreement on a matter, for instance, an advocacy matter. And we should also understand that while we have member organizations that are members of NGOCC, these are made up of individuals, and individuals have different affiliations. So as an organization, we need to strike a balance all the time in ensuring that we are getting consensus to a certain extent. And we are a non-partisan organization. However, when you are in a political environment, Zambia and every country is a political environment. Sometimes it may be understood because of this stand that you take, you may be understood to belong to this party or that party. But these are, it's a terrain that we need to navigate. And then sometimes, of course, we have even challenges around resources, because what we do can cost us quite a bit of money. We have to train people. We have to sometimes convene meetings for people to speak about pertinent things. So those are some of the challenges. But how we navigate about them is negotiation, discussions, understanding, empirical evidence as well, saying, look, the reason why we're pushing this matter is because the evidence on the ground suggests this. For instance, who can argue that there are very few women in leadership when you have the figures. So if you say, look, let's talk about women in leadership, then, you talk about the figures. Then the whole collective says, oh, yes. So this is what we're talking about. Indeed. Let's go ahead and advocate, or let's do this. So that consensus building through the dialogue and negotiation. And then when it comes to resource mobilization, we have some partners that have been very, very faithful and worked with us. Like, for example, the Swedish Embassy has been working with NGOCC, supporting us around what we do for a very long time. The Carter Center too. We've had the EU, and we've had a number of cooperating partners that help us. We also, as an organization, are cognizant of the fact that we need to also look at our own self-generated resources, and we do some of that as well.
Very interesting. Now, Madam, you have mentioned about the 111 members and some of the cooperating partners that you have, as well as some community-based organizations. Can you please maybe just elaborate on the structure of these 11 organizations and how you just manage to coordinate them?
Okay, the structure is that the member organizations, if we're to look at an organogram, for example, the member organizations are at the top because they form this organization. The secretariat, for which I'm executive director, is the executive arm that implements the interventions on behalf of the member organizations. So the member organizations can either be full members or they can be associate members. We have criteria that defines that. But the common strand is that all of us must have some focus on gender equity and equality and the empowerment of women in some form. And we also encourage women-led organizations to be members of NGOCC because we want to encourage women, in leadership. So with the member organizations at the top, the member organizations through a general assembly elect board of governors that are the ones that give the policy direction to the secretariat in the implementation of our activities. So we report as a secretariat to the board of governors, and the secretariat has got a team of technical staff that then drive the program, which derives from our strategic plan.
How has NGOCC partnered with government over the years, and how has it supposed to be working hand in hand with government? Do you ever at any point partner with government to achieve some of the objectives?
We can't do, as civil society, we cannot achieve anything on our own. And you know that the drivers of policy, the drivers of legislation are different. There's the executive and there's parliament. So we have to, and then there's the judiciary as well. Because, for example, when we talk about gender-based violence, there are different arms that help us achieve our goals. We have the police involved in that. We have the judiciary because some of these cases have to go for litigation. And then when we talk about legislative reform, we have parliament. And then the policy, the people that lead policy and drive even the change of the change in policy and legislation are actually ministries or government ministries. This is where that comes from. So we do work very closely, even at the moment, with the gender division, because that is what we have in place now as a national structure in government. The gender division is housed under the president's office, and they are our government interlocutor around gender. But then you know that gender cuts across many sectors, across everything. So we do interact or we do communicate and collaborate with different government ministries, depending on what it is we are talking about at that particular time. For instance, when we talk about social protection for women, it's the Ministry of Community Development. If we want to talk about the marketeers, for example, it's Ministry of Local Government. So it depends, but our main interlocutor is the gender division.
Now, you talked about the four objectives that you have as an organization. This then prompts me to want to find out what are some of the future plans or strategies that you want to achieve as an organization. Before we talk about the 10 and 40, because I want to touch a bit on that one, but perhaps you could give us a little bit of an insight on some of the future plans or strategies that you intend to do as an organization.
Well, key for us is to see a woman that is economically empowered and able to stand for herself and to reach her fullest potential. We want to see every young girl thrive, and go through life to the vision that she has for herself. That is what we want to see. How we get there depends on the contextual environment, as I said, and we're a learning organization, an adaptive organization. So as we learn, we change our strategies. But at every given time, we're very, very conscious of what is happening around us, what is affecting women and girls, and that's how we adjust and adapt. But the goal remains the same.
Yes. NGOCC turns 40.
Indeed.
Quite a milestone.
Yes.
So perhaps you could run us through just how the whole journey has been, and in the next 10 years, what should we look forward to?
Well, NGOCC turns 40 and had a lot of achievements around policy, even around practices, around beliefs. And what we'd like to do as we go forward in the next 10 years is to see even some of these policies begin to actualize in the way Zambia manages its gender equity and equality, that we get to a more balanced nation. And for us, by the way, as we talk about gender equity and equality, we're actually holistic in ensuring that there are that no one is left behind. And we really are very concerned also about ensuring that the person with disability and of course the youth are also part and parcel of participating in social, economic, political and cultural development. So we want to see all the efforts that we've made actualize in the lives of women and girls, and in our processes as a country, in our institutions. We should see gender equity and equality, in reality.
We're looking forward. Now, recently, on the 5th of March 2025, NGOCC, in collaboration with the University of Zambia, hosted the Beijing Plus 30 public lecture. What does this mean for you as an organization that you're turning 30, and then there's the Beijing also turning 40, and then there's the celebration of the Beijing Plus 30? So what does this mean for you as an organization that advocates for women and looking at the 12 critical areas that the Beijing Plus 30 focuses on?
This is it's a milestone for us, and it's even more of a milestone because there are some eminent women who have been part of NGOCC and remain part of NGOCC who actually were there at the time Beijing 40 was being construed. So for us, it's a good time to actually see what was agreed on at that time, how it has informed where we are now as a country, and this was the basis of the public lecture that we hosted on the 5th. What we looked at was we had commissioned a desk study as NGOCC to actually determine where we are 30 years down the line. And then from there, we wanted to reflect on, based on what we've achieved now, what else is there that should be done? And how should we do things differently to get to where we want to go? We're not yet there, that I think we all agree, but we also celebrate, some of the achievements that we have had. So it's good that Beijing Plus 30 is coming at a time that we're also looking at NGOCC Plus 40.
Yes.
And we will be looking at our input into Beijing Plus 30 and how we look at those critical areas as we go forward too.
A campaign was launched which you just spoke about just before we conclude, that is wanting to see the inclusion of women in participation of politics. How do you intend on achieving this?
We're doing this with a multi-pronged approach. One is we're looking at the legal framework, and we are right now talking to various groups, including government, the members of parliament, and different groups, to see how we can bring in legal frameworks that will ensure that we have more participation of women. And that includes political parties, because political parties is where this all begins. If the participation is low there, then that will be seen, right through the spectrum. And we're also looking at changing mindsets of communities. I talked about the social cultural norms, and beliefs. We still have that thing because of socialization processes where people think only men can lead. We have fantastic women that have been leading in different ways. We have some fantastic women in parliament right now. We have fantastic women leading private sector, and women have the capacity, and we bring our own perspective as women to leadership. If you look at the coat of arms for Zambia, that is one thing that we always want to give an example of. There's a man and a woman carrying the coat of arms. In other words, if we don't have equal participation, even in politics, it means that we're falling short of the full capacity that we have in this country. So we'll be looking at legal frameworks, we'll be looking at changing mindsets, and we'll be looking at any policies that needs, that could help in improving this spectrum, but also particularly at the way political parties are conducting their business. Those need to change and give more space and more room to women.
Very interesting. Now, I have been interacting with Ms. Mbewe-Anamela, who is the Executive Director for the NGOCC, and of course, she has done quite a number of things. I hope that your dear viewer has gotten the insight or learned one or two things regarding the non-governmental gender organizations coordinating council. But before I let her go, perhaps ma'am, you could just give a word of advice to the girl child out there who is living in remote areas and is aspiring to become someone like you in future. So perhaps just to conclude remarks and a word of encouragement to the girl child and to the women watching.
The word of encouragement to the girl child and to every woman is that always believe that you can be who you want to be. You should aim high and know that you can get there. Never be discouraged by any obstacles that you find in your way. When you find an obstacle, your thought should be how to get around that. And your thought should be, who can help me to get around this obstacle? Never give up on your plans. You can be anything you want to be, and you are very, very important to the development of this country.
Yes, true. Thank you so much, ma'am, for coming through.
I'm very honored.
We're also happy that you're the one who did the first podcast. I have been your host. My name is Chibesa and on our first ever podcast, we tackled what NGOCC is, and we believe that your dear viewer has learned what NGOCC is. See you on the next podcast.